The future course of South Korea's foreign policy has been rendered uncertain, given the parliament's vote in favor of the president's impeachment motion. We have more on the diplomatic repercussions of these latest events on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, December 17th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we revisit the broader diplomatic implications of the political fallout here in South Korea. So what have been the reactions from our friends and our foes, if you will, to news of the president's suspension from duty? To answer this question, I have Shin Hieun with Agence-France Presse here in the studio. Shin, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Nikkei Asia here in the studio as well. Steven, as always, it's good to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Right, Hieun, we'll start with you. Let's begin then with the latest from the Constitutional Court regarding the political fate of the suspended president.
Yes, so President Yoon Suk-yeol has been suspended from his position as of Saturday evening. And Prime Minister Han Duck-soo will now be the interim leader of South Korea. He will govern the country a maximum of 8 months, depending on how long the deliberation will take and what the results are. So the Constitutional Court has about 180 days, so 6 months, to deliberate the motion. And the last such motion that happened was former President Park Geun-hye, and that only took 92 days to review the motion and remove her from office. So what happens is the Constitutional Court requires 6 votes in favour of the motion in order for the motion to pass. And they have currently 9 seats. But currently there are only 6 members and 3 seats are empty, which means that the 3 seats need to be nominated. And as Parliament Speaker Woo Won-sik said, the National Assembly will do its best to appoint the other 3 members. However, yesterday the Constitutional Court did say in a statement that doing it with 6 judges is fully possible and a deliberation with them is fully possible, but that would mean that the vote would have to be unanimous.
Right. And in the meantime, Stephen, what has been the reaction from neighboring Japan to the result of the impeachment vote this past Saturday?
The Prime Minister said that he wishes for Tokyo to keep communicating with South Korea. I mean, I think it's the kind of middle-of-the-road, temperate statement that you would expect when you're talking about a country that's in a kind of major transition period. I don't think there's really all that much that diplomats and other officials in Japan can really say as the situation here plays itself out. Like as Hieun just laid out, like we've passed this kind of significant milestone of Yoon having been formally impeached, but there's still this court process that needs to play itself out. A lot of like Korea-Japan relations will ultimately depend on who wins the presidential election, when and if we get one. If it's the left-leaning Democratic Party, then there might be some fairly significant changes to Korea-Japan relations because there's just a kind of different orientation towards relations with Japan than the Yoon administration put forth. But I think Japan is among Korea's many diplomatic partners that have really little choice right now, but just kind of wait and see what happens and just kind of hope that they can maintain a sort of baseline level of cooperation in the meantime.
Right, which is also probably the case for those in the U.S. I mean, here, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken claimed that the impeachment vote stood as proof of Korea's democratic resilience. Could you tell us a bit more about the response from the U.S.?
Well, it is an understatement to say Blinken's response till now has been somewhat measured but very firm throughout. I mean, South Korea is one of the United States' most important allies, and they do have troops here. So it's really important for Washington to know what is going on with the country's democracy. Initially, when the martial law was lifted, Blinken did say he welcomed President Yoon's decision to rescind the order, and he also said that he hopes South Korea will resolve all these conflicts in accordance with the rule of law. And this came in the context of that the President Biden administration did say that they were not notified beforehand about the martial law, and also National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan adding that they actually learned about the martial law through watching the news. So a lot of experts did worry that this will actually harm the alliance in some way, and especially trust-wise. However, after the impeachment vote was finalized, Blinken did say that South Korea demonstrated democratic resilience, and he also said that they've seen South Korea follow peacefully a process within their constitutional order. And he also added, which is I think very important, that he's ready to work with President Han, referring to Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. And he also mentioned about the ROK-US alliance, saying that it was very ironclad. It was the same with the State Department as well. Matthew Miller saying that the alliance is still going on strong and they look forward to working with South Korea. So clearly, these quotes do show that the alliance does remain strong and it is unharmed despite the martial law.
Right, despite the political disorder here. Steven, North Korean media, that is, also covered the result of the South Korean parliament's impeachment vote. What exactly did the media there say?
I think we could say that they kind of gloated over it. Like they seemed a little bit smugly kind of happy to see this dysfunction in our people in South Korea. One thing that I thought was interesting about it was if you read the KCNA dispatch, they really highlighted the role of public dissatisfaction and the kind of people power element of this. They said something like throngs of enraged people converged on the National Assembly and they sort of pushed Yoon out of office. I counted, in this KCNA dispatch, they used the English language one, they used the word puppet 20 times, which I wondered if that was a record. But the reason that I thought that homing in on that aspect of it was interesting was because in recent years, in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of measures in North Korea to really crack down on any kind of expressions of popular dissent, access to any kind of culture that would change the way people think and kind of getting people perhaps to have ideas about pushing back against the very repressive state in North Korea. We've seen expansions of border security to make it harder and harder to get out of the country. So by all indications, this is a state, this is a leadership that is increasingly nervous about keeping their own people in line. So I thought it was, in both Korean and English versions, I thought it was interesting that they chose to highlight the fact that this is an example of a population rising up and pushing its own leader out of office. Of course, that is something that the South Korean system allows for, that it has mechanisms for, but the North Korean system, of course, does not. I mean, so that North Korea does not enjoy civil and political rights, so it's not possible to mount a kind of activist or a mass assembly kind of effort to change the way things work. But I thought that was interesting and perhaps indicated something about the way that North Koreans are thinking. Perhaps it was just as simple as wanting to demonstrate Yoon Suk-yeol's unpopularity. I had one analyst tell me that the reason that until this one dispatch came out, North Korea was kind of keeping quiet because they wanted to make sure that Yoon got out of office, because Yoon had made some comments about North Korea that were a little bit provocative and that the Pyongyang leadership wouldn't have liked. He made a speech in August of this year on Liberation Day where he kind of encouraged North Koreans to rise up against to kind of become, I think, warriors for unification. He put it so. If anyone in North Korea misses or is upset about Yoon being out of office, I don't think they're speaking up. There's probably not very many of them.
Right. The regime for now seems to be using the political fallout here as a kind of propaganda purpose.
As they tend to do.
Right?
As they tend to do.
Hyun, quite a big portion of the foreign media coverage continues to focus on the potential reasons behind President Yoon Suk-yeol's unilateral decision to declare martial law on the night of December 3rd. What are some of the more common explanations shared by the foreign media?
So even before the martial law happened, Yoon was considered as one of the most unpopular presidents in the history of Korea, and that was due to a row of scandals that most of them had nothing to do with him. Rather, they had to do with the First Lady. And so he was accused of abusing his presidential vetoes, notably to strike down a bill to investigate allegedly the First Lady's stock manipulation charges as well. And so President Yoon explained the reason why he declared martial law as that he wanted to safeguard the country's liberal democracy from anti-state elements and threats posed by North Korea. But he did give little explanation to what these threats exactly were and what these forces were as well. And also this martial law came in the context of a whole budget war between the opposition party when the opposition cut around about 1.4 trillion won for next year's budget. And Yoon complained that the opposition party was cutting all these nations' core function budgets. And the problem is he has been a lame duck since earlier this year because the opposition party actually won a parliamentary election for a majority, so he did have no say in the parliament votes at all. Yoon also said that one of the reasons why he declared martial law was because he needed to send the military to the national election commissions, saying that the commission was vulnerable to hacking, and he doubled down on the electoral fraud claims, which is quite considered as far-right conspiracy theories. And he's justified that he had no intention of damaging the constitutional order, but rather he wanted to warn the opposition party and if they were to keep on doing what they were doing right now. Experts do see this as kind of a move of desperation to break out, both in like a political and policy sense, but in the end it was really poorly played.
Right. A desperate perhaps attempt to assert authority then,
yes,
over perhaps his the opposition party. Steven, there is also continued coverage about the diplomatic impact of a prolonged political paralysis here in the country. What are some of the concerns being raised?
Well, to borrow a phrase from the Yoon administration, Korea is in some ways a pivotal state. So any kind of disruption to governance here is going to be felt around the world. A lot of countries conduct a lot of trade with Korea. A lot of countries have defense partnerships with Korea. The APEC summit is scheduled to be held here next year. So I'm sure there is concern, but we have to keep in mind that like a lot of the real day-to-day work of these matters does not take place on the executive level of government. It takes place, by rank and file government workers who are communicating with their counterparts overseas. And there's no really strong reason to believe that, for example, the activities of the foreign ministry or the activities of the trade ministry are being significantly disrupted by now. I think there's a consensus among even the dueling political parties that like the business, to whatever extent is possible, business as usual needs to continue. So I think just for context, we also need to keep in mind that this is not the first, political upheaval we've seen in contemporary South Korean history. This kind of thing has happened before, and it's not going to be as surprising or as shocking here as it might be in some other places. And for that reason, it's probably not going to be as disruptive. So let's also keep in mind that like even on December 4th, the morning of December 4th, the day right after this happened, like life went on as usual. Like schools were open, businesses were open, government offices were open. I've met many Korean government officials over the years, and I've known them all to be very hardworking and very professional and very serious about what they do. So as of now, I don't think there's any indication, there's any reason to believe that there are big disruptions in the offing. Financial markets are functioning, traffic at ports and airports are going ahead. So I think Korea has earned a reputation as an ultimately stable country, and I don't think there's too much nervousness in the air.
And speaking about the hard-working government officials that Steven highlighted, Hieun, what are some of the priorities for the government here to minimize perhaps the internal repercussions of this political fallout?
Yeah, so I mean the first and foremost priority, as Prime Minister Han Duck-soo put, is that they need to ensure that even not the slightest disruption can happen in the administration of state affairs. I mean, the challenges are immense. There are some ministers who have resigned, some who are still under investigation over their alleged roles of the insurrection. So it's very important to stabilize the ministries as soon as possible to prevent further destabilization. The other would obviously be the economy, since South Korea's economy was impacted the hardest by the political turmoil. The martial law definitely brought these uncertainties both in the domestic market and the international market as well. The impeachment kind of eased somewhat of this, but still South Korea's exchange rate did hit a 2-year low. And Prime Minister Han and the opposition leaders do agree that they do need a task force to stabilize the economy as soon as possible. The other risk would be security risks, especially posed by North Korea, since, as Han put it, the Ukraine war is still ongoing. And the stakes are very high, since North Korea's alliance with Russia is as strong as it can be possible, which is why one of the first things that Prime Minister Han did was directly speak to President Biden and ensure and reaffirm that the ROK-US alliance is still ongoing, since the relationship is just critical to actually deter this North Korea aggression during this political turmoil.
And staying with this, Stephen, this is an impromptu question. Now, Mr. Trump is poised to come into power on the 20th of January. And there are some pundits who claim that as part of his plans to perhaps create a legacy, he might reach out to North Korea directly for dialogue. Keeping in mind the perhaps power vacuum here at the top office, chances are high that Mr. Trump may reach out to Kim Jong-un directly without South Korea being involved in these talks. What would be perhaps the danger, if you will, of such an engagement between the U.S. and North Korea in the absence of South Korea?
I'm going to answer a little bit of a different question. I'm just going to say, before we get into that, like the potential follow-up, potential danger, we have to, I think, first assess the likelihood of it. And I'm of the opinion that Kim Jong-un is probably not interested in more dialogue with Trump. I think he's kind of been down that road. And I think he suffered like what he experienced as an embarrassment in Hanoi several years ago. And so I don't think that just the optics or the high-level splash of a meeting with the American president really appeals to him all that much anymore. And I think he and the North Korean leadership more generally have concluded in recent years that there is not much for them to gain in the kind of U.S.-South Korea relationship. I mean, for North Korea, those two things are very much connected. They can't really parse them wholly separately. And everything that we've seen from North Korea in recent years has shown that they see relations with Russia and, to a lesser extent, China as their future. So I think even if Trump, I mean, first of all, when Trump takes office, I think he's going to have a lot more pressing matters to deal with, even on foreign policy. You know, the Ukraine war, the situation in Israel, Gaza, the relationship with China. Trump's first Asia priority is going to be finding some way to contain China. So he's going to need South Korea to do that. So I don't think he would reach out to North Korea immediately, because he knows that will kind of displease South Korea, and he's going to kind of have that in mind. And just like I said, going back to the likelihood of it, I just don't imagine that Kim Jong-un would be all that interested in engaging in that kind of meeting, because it would raise the possibility that he would fall short again in the way that he did in 2019, and he would probably ask for something like a kind of guaranteed outcome from Trump, and Trump is not going to do that. So I see it as something of a dead end, but when you're talking about North Korea and Donald Trump, I mean, who knows?
Right. South Korea, under the current Yoon administration, has adopted a tough stance toward North Korea, of course. Do you suppose if South Korea were to come under, were to have the opposition Democratic Party in power, do you suppose dialogue with North Korea would be possible then?
I don't know about possible. I mean, I think they would be interested in it. I mean, if Lee Jae-myung is the president, and a lot of the kind of mainstream establishments of the DP are from that kind of late 80s activist generation for whom unification is a kind of overarching goal, and they, at least rhetorically, stick to this idea that engagement with North Korea is necessary, negotiations are necessary, and ultimately the two sides must use dialogue to find some kind of peaceful settlement. So I think they would want that, and I think they would, at least rhetorically, they would initiate that. You know, and if a DP leader becomes president, I think in his inauguration speech he would say something like, "And I'm up here to, you know, extend an overture to our brethren in the north." But whether or not North Korea would be interested in that is a very different question, and I would just go back to all indications that we have being that North Korea is not super interested in the relation with South Korea and the U.S. anymore, just because of the quite tense, restrictive effect of sanctions. And, you know, even under the Moon administration, for all the diplomatic activity they had and for all the outward shows of collegiality they had, they kept running up against this question of sanctions. And Moon was not willing to go far enough as to engage in contact with North Korea that would violate sanctions, because they still value the relationship with the U.S. They still value being a kind of responsible member of the international community. So it's possible in the sense that we can't rule it out, but I see a number of hurdles to it.
Right, for sure. And here, this is also an impromptu question, but if I were to ask you, and speaking, of course, as a journalist for Agence-France Presse, based on what you've seen on the ground, do you suppose prospects are quite high for the opposition party to win a snap election here in South Korea?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, currently the polls for the People's Power Party and the Democratic Party are like 8-2 currently at the minute, and the most trusted politicians in the polls from the first to the third are from the Democratic Party members. Clearly, the ruling party, or the PPP, have lost the trust from the people. So it will definitely take some time for them to build the trust with the people, and just let them know that this kind of thing will not happen again in their administration. Whereas the Democratic Party have definitely demonstrated their beliefs in democracy and how they will act to it, especially at the National Assembly. So they do definitely have a better chance.
Right. And Steven, given the latest developments, what do you believe are perhaps some of the follow-up stories that are being planned perhaps by members of the foreign press like yourself?
Well, I'm on here with a colleague from a competing media organization, so I don't want to say too much about anything else I might be planning, but I feel like there's kind of two threads for coverage going ahead. One of them is procedural, and one of them is just like doing stories that allow readers to allow readers to understand what is going to happen next, how does it happen, how likely is it. Those are the kinds of stories that are hard to make particularly engaging for readers who are maybe not already interested in the mechanisms of the Korean legal system. I mean, it's kind of interesting that Korea has a constitutional court. You know, a lot of countries don't have those. They just decide everything at the Supreme Court level. And the mere existence of this constitutional court is kind of a legacy of the political dissension that has been a feature of South Korean history, and that you have this whole legal body whose real purpose is to mediate political disputes and to be a kind of authority to rule on those. So that's interesting. Another kind of thread that I have in mind for reporting is more kind of contextual, more sort of explanatory, doing reporting and getting stories that sort of illuminate, like, where did this come from? Why does South Korea, which is like on its face a wealthy and efficient and high functioning society, why does it have these kinds of bitter divisions? There was a good column in the Financial Times newspaper today by Korean economist Jang Ah-jun, where he sort of offered some theories as to part of the political upheavals that we see in Korea, like, or they're to an extent, somewhere that they come from is the state's underinvestment in social welfare. Just the fact that there are a lot of people here who are struggling economically, like, who don't have access to decent jobs, who don't have strong incomes, particularly among older people. And it is he argues that, like, to some extent, the reason that we see a very divisive political climate is because there are people who are in some ways dissatisfied and enjoying not the kind of material well-being that they would like, and they are therefore looking for answers to how they've ended up that way, and then they inevitably end up blaming someone and feeling angry to some extent. And he kind of suggested that the next Korean administration, to sort of calm the political climate and to maybe take steps to prevent this kind of thing, it ought to make more generous investments in welfare, in fair working conditions, in stronger wages, in maybe pensions, education, like all the things that people need to feel as though they are cared for and they have a stable life and a stable future. But that, of course, those are all very difficult questions that the next administration will have to tackle.
Right, but that really is, of course, a very important aspect of life, though, and addressing the concerns of the ordinary people in any country. All right, Stephen, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Hieun, thank you very much for your insights. Right, well, that brings us to the end of the Press Perspective for today. We'll return same time tomorrow with the economic implications of the political turmoil.